before I start, I'd like to make 2 points. One, the media I refer to here are television channels, and the two, my presentation may be considered just as a point of view, or maybe at best as a hypothesis. This is something, this is something out of a provocation of something that I thought was extraordinary, which I saw in the last phase, the last phase of the elections, or maybe a month ago. Maybe it was transient, but this is something that struck me, and I thought I should speak about that. See, I'll start with what's happening in India, then I'll come to what's happening in my view, in the state, or what has happened in Kerala recently. See, what's happened to India's mainstream news media, especially television, over the last few years, or more precisely ever since the BJP's ascent to power began, is an open secret. What was for long an exciting, vibrant, democratic, and heterogeneous public space has shrunk into where one hears only one voice, the voice of the state and the party that is running it. Since 2014, this transformation of the national media, which is considered the largest in the world, has been systematic and fast. And the most obvious turncoats have been the English and Hindi channels. It's bizarre indeed that on political issues of public interest, governance, human rights, art, and even science, the channels have the same voice, tone, and tenor, that of the BJP, as if they've all been manufactured and fed from a single source. These days, the only way one can tell one channel from another is from their anchors, the graphics, and the colors. And what's even more bizarre is that they all have become louder than ever before, as if loudness makes them more believable. Describing the state of play of Indian news media to this panelists and the participants of this webinar will be stating the obvious and preaching to the converted. So I'll stay away from that. You all know it. However, I'll try to underscore some observations that the New York Times had made in an article on the state of Indian media in the wake of the COVID epidemic in last April. It quoted Indian journalists to say that since the Prime Minister Narendra Modi came to power, his government has tried to control the country's news media, especially the airwaves, like no other prime minister in decades. It also said that Modi has shrewdly cultivated the media to build a cult of personality that portrays him as the nation's selfless savior. So when we look back, particularly at the last phase of the Congress-led UPA, when Delhi was rocked by anti-corruption protests, did we ever think that the same vociferous media that brought the ruling establishment to its knees will suddenly become so mute, docile, and completely pro-establishment? And that they would forever be finding fault with the Congress for all the failings and debacles of the BJP, that too even after 7 years? That they would keep quiet even when the constitutional institutions and fundamental rights of the people came under threat? Certainly not. But why did it happen? There is a reason. I'll come to that in a while. What began as a predictable act of sycophancy among a few loyalist journalists when Modi began campaigning for the prime ministership before 2014 became a general trend in a few years in which people were competing with each other to please his party and his establishment. Not that all the editors and journalists were bona fide fans initially, but sooner than later, they all became one. In the process, every single misstep or a big blunder of the government, whether it was a notorious demonetization or the way it bungled in handling the COVID epidemic, went uncriticized, even as the cult of the leader went from strength to strength. The ultimate tragedy was that the fourth pillar of democracy, which had stood by the oppressed and the opposition over the last 7 decades, finally fell. As journalist Rajdeep Sardesai would tell New York Times correspondent, a large section of the Indian media had become a lapdog, not a watchdog. This historic dismantling of a great democratic institution called the media followed a certain process that used state power, crony capital, and Praxis, if I could use a term like this, and control mechanisms such as fear, social media slander, and bullying, among others. This process is exactly what Edward Herman and Chomsky had termed as the propaganda model in his famous 1988 book, Manufacturing Concept. What's happened to Kerala's media in the last phase of the present government before the elections is a curious replay of the same propaganda model that has been at play at the national level for quite some time now. Historically, Kerala's media has been by and large diverse, progressive, and fiercely anti-established. It had never been an unanimous party to a political cult. I'm not denying the fact that some traditional outfits had their political leanings and have indeed played a certain role in the state's political affairs, but politically, all of them have never been together on the same boat. Despite the otherwise diverse political leanings, styles of journalism, and business models, the television channels in the state started mimicking their national counterparts during the phase I just mentioned. Strangely, the socio-political plurality started blurring. I mean, the socio-political plurality of the state's diverse media started blurring, and they all started to look and sound similar. In the run-up to the elections, what one saw was a cult of a single leader and the infallibility of his government. It was a culmination of a process of homogenization of voices that literally killed dissent and manufactured a certain consensus. That's where my title comes from. The consensus that the king can do no wrong. I said manufactured because till then, the media had different tunes, but just for a month or so, they all sang in the same tune and same pitch. Immediately after the elections, they did go back to their old diverse ways. So the question is, what happened during this critical pre-election phase, such a short phase? There were scams and scandals galore, about a dozen corruption charges, many of which the government first denied, including in the State Assembly, and then conceded to. Resignation of 5 ministers and a big scam that involved not only citizen money, exactly the way the previous government was involved, but also national security. There were massive strikes by unemployed youth against the government's alleged illegitimate employment of its cronies, a move that was struck down by the High Court also a possible attempt to rig the voters list. But nothing seemed to matter to the media during the crucial phase of campaigning. Instead, it was in a process of manufacturing consensus that the chief minister was incapable of making mistakes and the ruling dispensation would come back to power. The circumstances I mentioned, particularly with the rich legacy of dissent, one would expect an anti-incumbent media, but what we saw was a pro-incumbent ally. But why? Here is where I'd go back to the propaganda model of Herman and Chomsky, or more precisely, the 5 classes of filters that make it work. I mean, the propaganda model. These filters, as most of you may know, are ownership and profit orientation, advertising, sources of news, flag, and the fear of the enemy. I'm sure you would agree that some of them are pretty straightforward. For instance, ownership and sources. The media outlets owned or funded by the party and its proxies, as well as those peddle news from the source of the establishment, will obviously be pro-incumbent or pro-establishment. Therefore, I'll skip them and focus on 3 filters, namely advertising, flag, and the fear element, because I think that is what worked in Kerala. Let me first focus on advertising. As you all know, advertising is the main source of media revenue. For more than a year, the advertising revenues of the media in Kerala, also in India, have plummeted because of COVID, and the media has been struggling to stay afloat. The propaganda model makes a point of this by saying that it's advertisers' vested interest that the media peddle. This is where the state played a big role in Kerala. Although it is hard to collate the financial figures, from what I gather from my sources, the state media, the state government and the party were the big advertisers during the critical phase. Opposition leader has alleged that the government distributed advertisements worth about 200 crore to the state's media when they were in distress. It is hard to verify them until the government voluntarily released the exact figures. I had seen at least one RTI answer in which the government had committed that it had released advertisements worth about 90 crores for a certain period. Chomsky and Herman say that advertisers become the de facto licensing authority of the news media, and hence they gratify the former's political prejudices. Did the media in Kerala do that? In my opinion, they did. Although I don't have a quantified content analysis, it's my anecdotal assessment that the ruling party and the government not only got a disproportionately higher airtime, they also were spared the usual aggression compared to the tenure of the previous government on the scandals, corruption charges, adverse court verdicts, and the raging anti-government protests by unemployed youth. In my opinion, the scams that the present government got embroiled in were much more potent than the solar scam and the bar scandal that sealed the future of the previous government. But still, they got away mostly unheard thanks to an uncharacteristically docile media. What was even more strange was a slew of opinion surveys that not only made the chief minister look unassailable, but made the opposition leader a politician with no popular support. As a feature in the Quint, a national news portal, reported, TV channels also had advertisements of the government's development projects as news items without telling the people that they had been paid for. In common media parlance, this is what is called paid news. I have cross-checked this with senior journalists from TV channels, and they confirm some of it was true. The reporter who wrote that feature went on Twitter to let people know that the proxies of the party and the government tried to sabotage the report and had been successful in at least temporarily tampering with it. The icing on the cake was that all the channels predicted the continuance of this present government. Although I wouldn't call them phony, I do find some of these surveys highly suspect, and most of them motivated, not because their predictions were similar and came from channels that had been heavily paid for through advertisements, but because they all looked highly unscientific and hence totally unreliable. As somebody who had done big sample survey-based quantitative studies in Asia-Pacific countries, I do believe that these surveys grossly lack the scientific integrity and transparency they require. None of them told the public their methodologies, including sampling and how they collected the data and processed it, and their limitations, which are central to any quantitative study. One channel even said that they surveyed 70,000 plus samples, which was laughable because a serious study of that scale would have been very expensive and time-consuming. The results by another channel were inherently contradictory, although they too predicted a return of the incumbent government. It may be recalled that the pioneers of election surveys in India, Pramod Kumar and Pramod Kumar, had said in their book, The Verdict, that Kerala is the most time-consuming and expensive place to conduct such surveys, and that the state election surveys didn't have more than 60% success rates, which was as good as a 50-50 chance. With this additional context, I find these surveys unethical because they do have the ability to influence opinions. That's why they had been controlled by the Election Commission in the past. There are sections of the electorate that might like to vote for a winning front because of their interests and insecurities. They are the ones who contribute to the late swing and word of mouth, as Prannoy Roy calls them, that can change the outcomes of elections. So I do speculate that they were something that drove these surveys. So do I speculate that whether something that drove these surveys? Yes, I do. That's what Chomsky had strongly suggested to me. Advertisers influencing the media, particularly because these advertisements were the lifeline in the face of the worst adversity they faced in many years. Now let me get to the element of flag. Flag is organized pushback from different quarters against media to deter them from publishing certain news. Although Herman and Chomsky wrote about it in the Cold War era, it looks more apt now because of the phenomenon called social media. That is exactly what cyberbullies and the huge social media ecosystem of a political party does. Anecdotally, I must say that I've seen a lot of flag activity during this phase by a range of groups from Kerala's unique cultural leaders to the so-called left profiles, including some journalists, and the vituperative and abusive cyberbullies. We see the flag in the pro-BJP and pro-Modi national media. We saw it in the coverage of Kashmir and West Bengal, and we also see it in Kerala whenever the ruling is dispensation came under criticism. According to Chomsky, it comes from politically and financially privileged actors. I guess I don't need to say more and hence would leave it there. Do I have examples? Of course I do. The last filter is fear, which Chomsky and Herman also refer to as anti-communism, because that is the lens through which they looked at the world. The suggestion was that anti-communist fear motivated the media to have a right-wing vested interest and hence publish news accordingly. The parallel I find in Kerala's media during the phase I refer to was the fear that nobody else could manage the state except the chief minister and his party. He was the sole face of the party and the government in all the campaigns. And his tagline harped on certainty, or rather than an authoritative certainty. An omnipresent cult leader and his promise of infallibility do have the ability to create a fear of failure in the minds of common people if the leader doesn't win again. It is not just TV channels that the propaganda model successfully had spun, but also the social media space. Because the positive time, I don't want to get into that in detail, but wouldn't certainly mind making a point that in my analysis, it was littered with news outfits and YouTube channels that were completely unidimensional and motivated. I'll give an example. The interviewer in one such channel says that the main item of the manifesto of the opposition UDF was Shabarimala, whereas in reality, it was a large-scale universal basic income scheme called the Nyai. From media reports, I do know that the state government has substantial budget for social media, and I do suspect that these outfits got funded directly or indirectly for their propaganda dressed up as news, because none of them seem to be financially viable. Of course, as happened in the case of Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton campaign, there also evidence of the deployment of bots, large-scale deployment of bots. You may recall the quote on Modi by New York Times that I mentioned at the beginning of my lecture, which said, his government has tried to control the country's news media, especially the airwaves, like no other prime minister in decades. I guess it'd be fair for me to say the same about the chief minister, his government, and the party. I haven't seen anything like this before in my life. So I'm turning Chomsky's manufacturing consensus on its head. Am I doing that? I would say no, because their thesis was to expose how the right-wing corporate media and the right-wing politics go hand in hand and beguile the public to safeguard their authority and vested interests. I'm pretty much saying the same here too. So are you wondering who is right-wing here? I leave it to you. So I can dump the whole Chomsky theory and summarize my point with more mundane American usage that we have seen it in a Robert De Niro movie, Wag the Dog. The point is, the dog wags its tail. But what happened if we wag the dog itself? Thank you for your patient hearing. This is, see, I was reading out from a prepared text because of the, the time constraint. Yeah, so that's it. Basically, that's my presentation.